Marketing and Development. Later today, you'll also hear from my colleague Paula Huguenin, who works as our division director. Some of you who have been around for a few years will remember when the state had a very large program to help spur the ethanol industry in Minnesota in the form of ethanol producer payments. As that program was nearing its sunset, a group of legislators and stakeholders and industry experts came together with the intent of creating a new program that would keep us as much of those funds as possible within agriculture. To that extent, they created the Agricultural Growth, Research, and Innovation Program that we refer to as AGRI. We really see AGRI as an economic or a rural economic development.
Can you speak closer to the mic, please?
Oh yeah, sorry about that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. We really see the AGRI program as an economic development program focused on agricultural issues and rural development. When AGRI first started in fiscal year 2013, we had an appropriation of about $10 million a year. Over time, that appropriation has gradually grown to about $16 million in fiscal year 22, close to $18 million in 23, and then we're looking at a base appropriation of $17.55 million in 24 and 25. With those funds, we administer about 14 programs on an annual basis. Those programs take the form of grants and cost share for the most part. I'm not going to list all of those programs, but you can see them on the documents in front of you as well as on the screen. We are going to talk about a few of those programs in a little bit more detail, however. Those programs are a combination of earmarked spending as well as flexible spending. Those earmarked programs within the budget rider range from our violent incentive program at $5.75 million per year down to some of our smaller programs like Farm to School, Good Food Access, and Urban Agriculture. The budget rider also allows for us to use up to 6.5% of the total appropriation for administrative costs. Once we take out those earmarked programs, that leaves us with about $3.5 million in more, I'm going to say, more flexible spending that allows us to do those long-term programs that folks also really care about. That flexibility is really important to the AGRI program. First of all, it allows us to fund those highest priority and best projects. On an annual basis, we don't always know which programs we are going to receive an overwhelming number of really great applications for. So that can allow us to divert some of those flexible funds into some of those programs, so that we're able to really fund those best projects that are going to make the most impact. It also allows us to respond to emerging needs. Some of you will remember the struggles that the dairy industry was going through a few years ago. So we were able to use some of those funds to help dairy farmers move from producing grade B milk into grade A, or to help maintain their grade A status. It also allowed us during COVID, particularly in 2020, to do some rapid response grants. These were small grants that we were able to step in and do before federal funds became available. For example, we had programs for farmers markets and direct marketing farmers, so they could do things at their farmers markets and on their farm to really pivot how they operated. So in that case, we were often funding things like signage, so people knew which direction to walk in. Also things like card reading machines, so we could do more contactless payment. Also at that same time, our meat processing industry was really going through a tough time. All of a sudden, we had many livestock farmers who lost their primary markets for processing. So we were able to step in with some very small grants to some of the state's small and medium-sized processors to help them invest in the equipment that they needed to be able to process more animals. Without the flexibility of Agri and that little bit of unearmarked money, we would not have been able to do that. We've also used Agri to access federal funding opportunities. Back around 2016, we had the opportunity to apply for about $8 million in biofuels infrastructure funding from the federal government. One of the things that made our application so enticing to the feds was that we had match funds available. So we were able to combine the federal government's $8 million with some Agri funds in order to make a very significant investment in the biofuels industry in Minnesota. More recently, we've been able to use Agri to help us apply for USDA funding to support our Farm to School program. Just recently, right now, we are in the process of awarding about $3.4 million in federal funds for Farm to a School. In fact, we were the first state in the nation to sign that cooperative agreement with USDA. We are making great progress on our 2023 grant making. We have a number of programs where we have already made awards. We also have some that are under review right now. In fact, in the time since we put these slides together to right now, I can say that our Farm to School grants, those award letters have gone out. So some went out yesterday, some today, probably a few more tomorrow. But those are actively going out right now. We're continuing to accept applications for a number of our programs, including our urban agriculture grant that is closing at 4 o'clock today. We'll also have a number of grants opening soon. One of the things that we talked a little bit about is our use of administrative funds. One of the ways that we do that is providing stipends to grant reviewers. We know that that there is this misconception out there that it's a bunch of folks sitting in St. Paul, our state employees who are making the decisions on how to award these grants and where to award them. But that frankly isn't the case. We are really relying on what we refer to as community-based reviewers. So that's going to be previous grantees, it's going to be farmers, it's going to be small business owners, it's going to be other industry stakeholders and experts who are helping to make those decisions. And we have found that by providing that small stipend, that you're getting high quality reviewers who are really invested in the process, and it makes it possible for reviewers who may not otherwise have the staff time to do it, to participate in the process. We also consistently meet or exceed the Office of Grants Management standards for grant making. For example, OGM requires that we do site visits on grants over $50,000. We are typically doing those on grants over $25,000. We also do most of our grants on a reimbursement basis. So the farmer, the small business, the organization goes out, they spend the money, they do the work, and then we reimburse a portion of their costs. We also work really hard to prioritize underserved communities, as we want our grants to be as accessible to all Minnesotans as possible. Several years ago, we really heard from this committee and others a desire for us to do a third-party evaluation of the Agri program. So we went out and we hired Transform LLC and some of their partners to do an evaluation of our work. Through that process, they interviewed some of our grantees, they interviewed in industry stakeholders, they did surveys. And they really found that 99% of our grantees were able to report that our grant positively impacted their organization. One of the other common themes throughout that report was that this program was very customer-centered. That we provide excellent customer service. a lot of people found it much easier to work with us than what you would typically expect out of working with a government agency. I've shared a lot about the nuts and the bolts of the AGRI program, but frankly, I'm not sure if that's what really tells the story of AGRI the best. So for that, I would like, so with your permission, Madam Chair, I would like to turn it over to my colleague to share the stories of impact in real Minnesotans.
Thank you, Director Brennan. Director Huguenin, please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The quote on the bottom of your slide that references clumsy government bureaucrats seems like the ideal time for me to take over this presentation. For the record, my name is Paul Huguenin. I'm the Director of the Ag Marketing and Development Division. It would be great if we had enough time to go in detail through all 14 of the programs that Ms. Bresch mentioned. But I think what might be more impactful is to highlight a small number of those and give you a specific example, especially for the new members we have here that are either new to the legislature or new to this committee. I want you to be able to kind of visualize what constituents we're working with, what kinds of projects that we're funding. The first such program is the Value Added Grant Program. This is a program where we help farmers and processors purchase the equipment and make facility upgrades so that they can process more of Minnesota's agricultural products. One thing I want to mention is the relationship that we have with AURI, who you've either heard from and certainly will hear from during the rest of the session. Some of their best expertise is related to technical assistance. So helping a value-added producer figure out the formulation and how to process it and what equipment they need. They can come to the department then for a value-added grant that's going to help them buy the equipment or make the actual physical upgrades to their processing facility to do that. So they're the two programs are very much complementary. This is also one of the more popular competitive programs that's out there. You can see on the chart that in fiscal 22, we had applications for over $5 million of projects. We awarded just over $1 million. This project opens up at the end of this month in January and will close in March. So if you've got folks in your district who are adding value to any agricultural product, please direct them our way, and we'd love to get them in the hopper as applicants. We have funded projects with this on all scales. We've done some really big projects. We've done some significant upgrades to meat processing plants in Minnesota. We've helped other large organizations, but we can also make an impact on companies that are relatively small and with relatively small grants. The example that I wanted to share with you is a woman by the name of Belen Rodriguez. Her company's name is Quebracho. She came here, she was born and raised in Argentina. She came here in 2018. She started a catering company based on her grandmother's recipe for empanadas. And I think you can all imagine what would happen to a fledgling catering company when COVID hits a year and a half, 2 years later. She needed to pivot, and she needed to pivot to a different market opportunity quickly. What she chose to do is develop a frozen consumer packaged empanada that she could sell in retail grocery stores. She used the value-added grant to buy some of the small processing equipment she needed. An empanada press, a Roboku food processor, some other small processing equipment. She has become quite the success story. She's been featured on KARE 11, Star Tribune. You can now buy her products in grocery stores anywhere from Thief River Falls down to the Iowa border, and at several, and even outside of Minnesota. But it's a good example of the impact this program can have on producers of different sizes. Similar to the value-added grant is the new meat, poultry, egg, and milk processing grant. Similar goals to value-added, but as the title indicates, it's focused on livestock processing. COVID really put a spotlight on the need for Minnesota to develop increased processing capacity, particularly slaughter capacity, at small and medium-sized processing plants. This program, as you can see, is also extremely competitive. We received applications for more than $3 million, and we were able to award just under half of that at $1.4 million to 26 different grantees. Many livestock producers, as many of you know, offer individual consumers the opportunity to purchase a quarter or a half of a beef animal or a half of a whole hog that can then go to a local plant for custom processing. For some farmers, that's, maybe a couple friends and a couple relatives, but for other farmers, it's a significant piece of their farm income, or in fact, what their farm business is based on. But as we go out and as we listen to farmers around the state, the one thing that they will all tell us is how hard it is to find processing space, particularly processing space that's convenient to them, that they can access economically efficiently. So that's where we enter one of our grantees, and that's Brandon Nelson with Midwest Meat LLC in New York Mills. Brandon originally had a mobile livestock processing trailer, which he still has. And when he knew he needed to increase capacity, he applied for one of these grants. He was able to use that to add a kill floor to his processing facility, add processing equipment that would increase his efficiency and his capacity, and also add cooler and freezer space, so that as a result, he more than doubled his capacity for how many hogs he can process and how many beef he can process at that plant. The third program that I'd like to highlight is our Farm to School program. First thing, there's three kind of different ways schools can engage or interact with this program. For schools who are new to Farm to School, they don't have relationships with farmers, we have what we call the First Bite program, so a much smaller amount of money designed to make those initial connections with local producers. Schools that have experience with Farm to School and they just want to do more of it, they want more resources to do that, we have our Full Tray program, which is a slightly larger amount of money and helps them fully build out that program. And then the third piece of it is that we have equipment grants. Many school districts around the state of Minnesota had shifted to basically a heat and serve model. And so they didn't have the ability to process the kinds of products that would come from a local farmer. So they needed to be able to buy apple cores and apple slicers. They needed to buy, equipment that they could slice squash with. In some cases, they needed more freezer space so that they could source products from Thousand Hills and be able to store enough to make the delivery efficient. As Ashley mentioned, we were able to leverage the agri appropriation to facilitate using up to $3.4 million of federal money. So having this infrastructure in place was really a game changer for us. One thing about Farm to School is that the whole goal is to connect schools with local farmers, so that local tax revenue is staying in the business and going to local farmers and local processors. But that means Farm to School often looks different from district to district and in different parts of the state. So for example, in some districts, Farm to School is naturally, they start with apples because they've got apple growers near them. In other parts of the state where they're surrounded by turkey farmers and a big turkey processing industry, Farm to School often starts with those products. And in some cases, it's wild rice, whether that be wild rice growers or whether that be wild rice harvesters. But the example that I'd like to talk about today is a school for whom buying specialty produce is what made the most sense for them to launch their Farm to School program. And that's New Millennium Academy in Brooklyn Center. It's a K-8 public charter school, and 75% of their students are either first or second generation Americans, many of whom are Hmong Americans who have strong familiar ties or cultural ties back to agriculture. And this program allowed them to really start and create a Farm to School program where they were partnering with the Hmong America Farmers Association, the Good Acre, and the Food Group. And it's just an example of how Farm to School can look different in every one of your districts, but yet the objective is always still connecting farmers to schools. The last program that I want to mention is one that's been around a long time, and that's the Sustainable Ag Demonstration Grant. Everybody in this room that's worked with farmers recognizes that farmers are innovators, constantly experimenting, looking for ways to lower input costs, increase profits, build soil health, become more energy efficient, and on and on. The whole point of this program is to help farmers do that. We can provide them funds where they can do a research project on farm. Usually it's a 2 or 3 year project. They're going to experiment with an idea, they're going to measure results, and they're going to share those results with other farmers by hosting field days. We're going to publish those results in an annual publication called the Green Book. In fiscal 23, we received $1.2 million in requests for about $250,000 that we had available to award. The project I want to share is, I just think it's so interesting and so timely, and this is Arlo Cristofaro Hark and Josie Troppel. These are our new farmers, they're beginning farmers, And what they're doing is doing grazing on solar facilities, solar sites. And in northeast part of the United States, for example, an organization has figured out what the ideal seed mix is to plant underneath solar panels that you could then graze. Well, that mix doesn't have any Minnesota native plants or Midwest plants that would do well here. And so what they're doing is testing out 4 different seed mixes to see which ones will do the best in those environments, and which ones will be the best for the sheep that they're grazing, et cetera. And that was done on a grant of just about $25,000. But it's a good example of farmers with an idea, and we're enabling them to test it, share the results that then can be applied to others. The last piece that I want to share is that we do an annual report. So for members who are new to this committee, on February 1st, you will get a very thick, detailed annual report from us. Couple things you can look for in it. One would be maps that will show you at a glance where in the state of Minnesota are we investing given grant program dollars, so that you can see who's close to you, who's in your district, who's nearby. We'll also have charts that list all the grant recipients, what they received the money for, and their legislative district, to make it really easy for you to be able to connect back with your constituents and see where we're investing this money throughout the state of Minnesota. And finally, I just want to thank you as legislators for the foresight all those years ago to create Agri, to ensure that the money that had been invested to help ethanol plants get started would stay as a very impactful force in helping agriculture and providing resources for farmers and agricultural processors. And I thank this group for your continued support for Agri throughout the years and as we move forward. For my staff, this is a really important program to work on. And we're really grateful for the opportunity that you've given us to help farmers with ideas. Ashley talks often about how much our staff loves being able to go out, talk to a farmer and processor, and be able to share the news that they've received a grant, and then be able to kind of go on that journey with them and see them as they grow, as they develop, as they become more profitable, as they develop new markets. With that, I want to thank you very much for your time and the opportunity to be here. We would be happy to do our best to answer any questions that the committee might have.
Thank you, Director Huguenin and Director Brennan, for your testimony. And as always, I appreciate all the work that you both are doing to make sure and support the work of ag all across the state. I think with the first question I have will be for the value-added grants, what are the usual award ranges?
Sure. Chair Vang and members of the committee, on our value-added grant, we will typically go up to $150,000 on a project. So to get an award of that size, it's going to have to be a pretty good project. And there's going to have to cost at least $600,000. On the smaller end, I think we'll go down. I would have to get back to you on the exact number on there. I think we're looking somewhere between $1,000 and $2,500.
Thank you. And then one more will be for the Farm to School grants program. How many schools are currently participating in that program? And I guess if you could provide some sort of geographic area as well.
Yep. Chair Vang and members of the committee, that's a great question. I don't have the data on how many schools statewide are just participating in Farm to School. I have some great colleagues who are really experts in the Farm to School program. What I can tell you, though, is that for the $3.4 million that we're in the process of awarding right now, we've received applications from 122 schools. Or actually, I should say mostly schools and school districts. That's most will apply as a school district. There will be a map in the upcoming legislative report of our fiscal year 22 grantees. For the fiscal year 23 grantees, I can't share that map yet, and we're still working on it as those contracts are still ongoing, but I can tell you that they range from the very far northern parts of the state all the way down to the southeast and everywhere in between.
All right, thank you. Representative Hansen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm looking at the sheet that says FY 2023 earmarked allocations. And, you know, I appreciate hearing the effectiveness of the small grants, and whether they're farm to school or good food access or urban agriculture. But when I look at the amount of money here it looks like the bioincentive and biofuels infrastructure together are more than all the others combined. So could you maybe tell us, maybe highlight what those are, how many years they've been getting them, and what the aggregate amount of money we've put into this has been?
Director Huguenin?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Representative Hanson. So the bioincentive program, and first thing I should say is that this committee will be getting a report just on the bioincentive program and then a separate one just on the biofuels infrastructure program within the next week. So you'll get a lot of detail on that. But in general terms, the bioincentive program it was created to provide incentive, financial incentive for people to develop products that are generally made from biomass. So they may be advanced biofuels, they may be advanced biochemicals. And there is a relatively complex formula in statute that lays out the reimbursement rates for that. It also spells out when they would need to begin production and how many years they can get it and when they would end production. I don't want to quote any of those numbers because I will not get those right, but they will be coming in a report within the next week. Biofuels infrastructure is a little bit different because what that does is help retail fuel stations add the equipment they need to be able to carry higher blends of ethanol or biodiesel. Because as you increase the level of biofuel, you will probably have equipment needs to be able to do that legally. So that's what that program does. In terms of how much, what the total amount we've awarded and paid out over time, those will be in those two reports, and I don't want to guess at a number off the top of my head, but that gives you at least a little bit idea of what those were targeted for.
Representative Anderson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Question again on the Farm to School program, and wondering if the program is a direct link between the farmer and the school, or if there can be a business involved in there. And the reason I ask that is there's business back in my area that they raise chickens and have a processing plant, and they have some high-end customers here in the cities, and they've tried to get into some school situations, and they're frustrated. They haven't been able to do that yet. So what advice could you give, or how could a grower, processor get into the Farm to School program?
Director Huguenin?
Madam Chair, Representative Anderson, I'll start on part of that, and then I'll see if Ms. Bress can clean up my mess. Short answer is, it doesn't have to just be direct from the producer. So it could be a processor, as you described, a processor of chickens who's sourced them locally and processed them. That would absolutely qualify for our program. Likewise, they can use a distributor, which is how schools get most of their food, is through a mainline distributor that's going to aggregate products. That's okay. Or it could be somebody like the Goodacre who's working with a number of producers. Those are all okay, and those are all eligible as part of our programs. In terms of what advice they might have, I think in really what most of these come down to is building a relationship with that local school food service director. If, for example, the food service director is under the impression that that wouldn't qualify as an eligible thing through our grant, then we can definitely help clean that up and make sure they're aware that it's absolutely eligible. But those are all good examples of the different ways what a farmer grows or raises can get into the school.
Director Bress?
Madam Chair, I have nothing to add. Thank you.
Sorry.
Representative Anderson?
No.
Any further questions from members? All right, seeing none, thank you so much for your testimony today. Appreciate you both being here today.
Thank you.
Next, we have is the University of Minnesota regarding AGREET, Agricultural Research, Education, and Extension Tech Transfer. We have Dean Brian Burr and faculty member Brandon Miller. If you can make your way to the testifying table, and please identify yourself before the committee, and you may proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Vang, members of the committee. I'm Brian Bloor. I'm Dean of the College of Food, Agricultural, and Natural Resource Sciences at the University of Minnesota. Thank you for the invitation here today. Joining me is Professor Brandon Miller, who is a faculty member in our Department of Horticulture and also holds an extension appointment for his work. This is a brief overview of a program that started, and actually I'll start with this picture. If you don't recognize this, this is the University of Minnesota St. Paul campus. So you don't see many urban buildings around it, but we're the largest agricultural plots of any major metropolitan area of the country, of 180 acres there. That block M in the midst of that is research on soybean production related to how we can advance oligosaccharides, basically the composition of soybeans so they're better for food ingredients because we can't digest soybeans very well. But people are often surprised if you haven't been there to find this 180 acres in the midst of the Twin Cities doing agricultural research on some of these advanced areas. The project we're talking about today is the Agriculture Research, Education, Extension, and Technology Transfer Program. It began in about 2015. And the idea behind it, the purpose was to support agricultural productivity growth. And one of the elements is, and listening to the Department of Ag folks present, there's sort of this local version, there's the broader global versions of how we're going to sustain and feed growing populations and do that in an environment where we have climate adaptation changes, we have invasive species in Minnesota, for example. How do we continue to keep on that technology frontier that helps us to advance that productivity across the spectrum of all types of agriculture? And that was the essence of where this comes to. And even today, as we look globally at the food needs, still a critical point. And part of that was to drive that through the research programs. Extension is that group with the programs within the University of Minnesota nationally that take that research innovation and moves that out to farmers, growers, to businesses so that they can adapt those technologies, put them to use, and then advance our agricultural productivity as well as our economies. So those two go jointly together. Of course, education is that piece where we deliver across the state. So Minnesota State colleges and universities are also part of GREET. There's a component in there for farm business management programs that also includes the Minnesota Ag Education Leadership Council that does advances agricultural education for training and future development of students. So those are the composition of the people and the programs within the university and other associated places that are engaged with the GREET. It's been quite successful. In the language, it actually has human infrastructure, so I put that quote in there. That was the priority, and that means the people to do the work. So whereas MDA was just talking about, and we do a lot of work as well in advancing programs like school programs, nutrition programs, looking at production systems for gardens and growers across the Twin Cities. This was about the faculty and the support to do that work. So what that does, instead of focusing on some specific program, it advances research in those areas where we see great potential for advancing agriculture across the sector. So not as much specificity. I will talk about some of the specific outcomes that have been happening with this program as well as I go through this. And one of the elements to this too is we do have an advisory panel. So this is not, as people often say, the University of Minnesota sitting back and thinking big thoughts and determining what we might do. We have 23 members on that board. They go across the span of agriculture, from organic agriculture to environmental MEP as part of the program, land stewardship program, corn growers, soybean growers, forest resources. And that advisory group serves with the Department of Agriculture. Commissioner Peterson is the co-chair with me on that advisory group and co-chairing the GREET program. And so we work with those groups to identify where these priority uses that have the most value for producers and for consumers as well as we advance this. So that's the basis of the statute that is in GREET, when we say GREET as the colloquial version of that. And as I said already, this is a joint venture with CFANS Vet Med, and CFANS is so I don't have to say the College of Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resource Sciences every time. That's the shorthand version. So when you hear that, veterinary medicine is a key part of this, and we'll talk a bit about that going forward, and those comprise that. Another element, and that's where the research and outreach components of GREET gets manifested in those two. The other part of that is Rapid Ag Response Funds. And this is a fund that's been supported by the legislature for over longer than GREET. There's a general fund for Rapid Ag Response Fund that's about $1 million. And the idea behind that is to address issues of importance to the state that occur in agriculture, to immediately address them, try to advance solutions to those challenges. So for example, recently one of the big ones, avian influenza, we had the outbreak, I think it was 2015 was the original round of that. This last year we had avian influenza come into the state again through migratory pathways. And so the issue is how can we advance and adapt ways to address that immediately? So for example, around avian influenza, the University of Minnesota with the Department of Agriculture worked to advance how we put biosecurity on farms to reduce people coming into barns and infecting flocks with that avian influenza, and finding ways to do that rapidly, quickly, so we could get in front of it. Diagnostic methods to be able to identify if a farmer actually had avian influenza or some other outbreak, which could prevent them from having to eliminate their flock because they were infected with avian influenza. So those are the types of things that happen with our rapid response funds. And each year, we again have a panel with those, and the people on that panel help us to identify what those issues are. Oftentimes, they're very clear what they are. They come at us. We've had one with Palmer amaranth, is a weed that's coming into Minnesota, highly invasive weed, destroys crops. Weeds are the #1 cause of crop loss globally. As that came into Minnesota, to try to find ways to control and prevent that, including regulations for seed as it comes in, just regular crop seed that could have, when it's harvested, could bring Palmer amaranth seeds in through that seed, gets planted in a field, and suddenly spread Palmer amaranth. So how do you identify that rapidly, those seeds in those environments? So that's the kind of work that gets done. And I've mentioned avian influenza research. There's a fund of $1 million that is for specifically avian influenza as part of a GREET to address long-term some of the causes, transmission, prevention, and protection from avian influenza. So those are the core areas within the portion that is the University of Minnesota portion of a GREET that comes through there. One of the big challenges, we have 23 groups. As you all know, when you have 23 different groups trying to identify what are you going to invest this money in, it can be a challenge. So one of the things we did in partnership with the Department of Agriculture was we put together with this group a set of surveys, evaluations of what are these key areas we can look at. One of the things we recognized, we, as the University of Minnesota, we attract a lot of grant funds for specific research projects, whether that's working on organic dairy, productivity, and so on. Recognizing we're working across the scope of Minnesota's agriculture, we came up, these are the pillars that we came to, and I apologize that writing is quite small on those. But the big picture was we tried to view it as what kind of investments could we make in research that would advance the good for the most people. So those were things, as you look through this, you'll find a lot of this is around environmental elements, which is basically soil health, soil quality, water, crop productivity and fertility, new development of crops. I'll talk through some of these as examples. Really looking at, if you're in agriculture, if you're a farmer and a production system, those core areas that everybody, whether you're a corn grower, a soybean grower, a tomato producer, across that spectrum is concerned about how we advance our productivity with improved soil quality, soil health, water quality, invasive species issues, and then advancing technologies in genetics and genomics that can move forward new varieties and new types of crops, which I'll talk a bit about later. And that has been, we think, a very successful strategy, because what it did is it brought together broadly across agriculture this conversation about how do we make these investments effectively, where do we think we'll have the most impact, what are the needs of our growers and communities and consumers. And so that started to identify for us who we would hire as we move through and investing these funds, which is that primary goal of the projects. So here's where we're at today. That's really a high-level version. I'm happy to answer questions more about specifics of that. Where we're at right now, and this has been, I use the words game-changing, and I don't use those frequently, but this truly was game-changing. As we look at it, and it's one of the elements when we talk to with the Farm Bill coming up at the federal level, one of the core issues of ag research, we call it slow magic. So for example, it takes us roughly 20 years to bring a new variety of soybeans, for example, so I had that image up there, into actual production and use in cropping systems. We have to increase our productivity roughly 3.5% to 4% a year globally to provide the food supplies and bioenergy supplies and other uses for crops we have. And so we're basically on that treadmill of trying to do that. Right now, our growth rate's about 0.5% last time I looked, so we're behind the curve. And so as we looked at doing this, we were in the place where these long-term funds to invest in faculty and research components, which does require fairly significant capital investments, the land I'm referring to when I showed that slide of St. Paul campus. But this allowed us to advance in a cluster of sorts, a group of people who are working to address these areas in a common set of underpinnings. So right now in CFANS, as you look through, we have 19 faculty that were hired in the College of Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resource Sciences across all of our programs. That goes from forestry to soil, water, climate, to animal science, and so on within that. Of those, with extension, which also the legislature supports, we have 8 faculty who have extension appointments. So Professor Miller, as well as faculty members who has CFAN's research appointment, so he conducts research. He's also charged with taking that research and deliver that to the communities and producers who use it. So he sort of wears both those hats and brings that. The ideal version of extension, I had an extension appointment one time, is to engage with communities they're working with, bring what they need back into that conversation. So we're finding a way to do both of those. For the other faculty, there are the others, not 11 of those, they have teaching appointments. So they're training, and we hear a lot from agriculture, food systems, forestry, the need for talent development in our natural resource agriculture systems. They're focused on those areas of bringing in that next generation of students into these programs. In the middle there, College of Veterinary Medicine, significant partner with us, of course, through animal science programs. 5 College of Veterinary Medicine faculty have been hired within that program, and within that 2 extension specialists, and then 11 extension educators. And for those of you who may not be familiar with extension, I want to emphasize this work is done across the state. So although we're in St. Paul, we have extension offices and represented all 87 counties in Minnesota. There's several regional offices across the state that the regional offices support a broad cohort of extension educators. And they're out there in the field, of course, day to day, working with identifying what are these issues that we need to solve in Minnesota, and how do we bring that connection of the University of Minnesota, its research, its programs, into those communities to do that work. So when you look at AGREE, it really does include the broad array of Minnesota, and including one of the areas that I'll talk about in a little bit is urban agriculture, a growing segment of agriculture for Minnesota. A lot of work going on there. You think about urban forestry, we have an urban forestry faculty member who's working on how do we, you've heard about the heat island effect in the Twin Cities from loss of forest, canopy cover and so on. Forestry is working on those elements. So this does cut across a broad array of Minnesota in doing this. So here's a few, I've actually talked through some of these, a few highlights, and I'll go through a few faculty here rather than have them join us today all together. The picture on the left of this, development of new crops, just as an example, some of you will have heard of this program as Forever Green. It's actually broader than that. We think of it as new and novel cover crops for agriculture. And one of our challenges is keeping the soil where the soil is. And in Minnesota today, you look out the window, it's not a great growing day. A lot of our fields have no cover on them during the winter when we harvest the fields. We can leave just the trash from harvest. So for example, we harvest corn, you get the corn stalks, they're on the field, that provides some cover. But can we in Minnesota, which is a cold environment, as Professor Miller talks in horticulture, one of our cores and one of the advantages of Minnesota and why we're so critical in agriculture is 45% of the world's agricultural production occurs within a band about 10 degrees around the 45th parallel. So we're in this band, if you look across the globe, so now we're hearing a lot about Ukraine and Europe, that band grows 45% of the world's crops. So the work we do here in this cold climate, where we're trying to advance how do we create more productivity with the land we have in an environment that only really works outdoors for about 5 months a year, how do you take advantage of that and move it to a place you can advance productivity? Well, these new and advanced crops, we're looking at, can we develop crops that emerge, and spring wheat would be, or winter wheat would be a version of this historically. You can plant it in the fall after you harvest. You get enough germination that provides cover on the land. Then it comes up in the spring. You might be able to harvest that crop in the spring and then plant corn or soybean into that crop and get a double crop in Minnesota. And so if you talk to farmers, that's been a challenge for quite a while. Obviously, it has some advantages for environmental consequences, keeping that soil there through the winter, avoiding some of the runoff that occurs, at the same time getting another crop. That's a significant program we have at the university. We're actually leading with that. Some of you may have heard of Kernza. General Mills is marketing now. It's a perennial wheatgrass, intermediate wheatgrass essentially, that we can grow so you don't till the land. It takes about 3 years. You'll have to replant and reseed, it looks like, research-wise, but it still provides that cover and gets a crop off it in sensitive areas. So that's the kind of work that's happening here that carries through year to year on returns. We're working across the swine industry, certainly in antimicrobial elements. And then, of course, when I talk about vegetable and horticultural side of this, a lot of work going on. How do we bring new varieties of crops, cold hardy crops into Minnesota, develop those as well as help with food safety and other elements of that. So you can see that cuts across that broad array of agriculture in Minnesota. This is an example, and one of the things CFAN's, the map of Minnesota on the left is our 10 research and outreach centers we have across the state. And so some of these people are located at those research outreach centers. One of the great things about Minnesota is that very different soils, very different watersheds, very different climates as you move from north to south, forested in the northeast to prairies in the northwest. And so we take this research and do it in those areas where that actually is occurring, which brings relevance to the growers in those areas through different products. The map on the right are the maps of the extension service and their offices, and where people can go in and gain information and knowledge about how to do these. That's the research value of that, but looking at what the return on investment is for AGREET. And this is since AGREET has started, and really we got our first faculty on the ground about 2017. By the time we had the funding, we had it established, we had set up the program, we got people on board, and have those faculty I was referring to either earlier. Those faculty have generated already, so over the last about 4 to 5 years, 203 grants from this research. Those are external grants, so the sample sources I have there, USDA, National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health. Zoetis is a private sector company working in animal agriculture. So across an array of investments outside of the state of Minnesota, so we're leveraging their work into getting more funds to support this work. And since that time, we've had $43.5 million in external grants coming in through AGREET to support that work. So it's taking the money that's invested by Minnesota's legislature and moving that into additional funds that help support this work. And if you add up the total recurring, which is about $4.8 million going into this over those 5 years, we've roughly not quite doubled that from money coming in through grants and contracts through that process. So it's been highly successful, and credit to our faculty, our tremendous faculty and research supporters and others in this, and the legislature for funding. It's been a great way to put us at the forefront of some of these really great challenges nationally. That's always a tip of the iceberg, is that direct funding that comes in. One of the things about agriculture, I always think of it as like an annuity. So every year when we plant a crop, we get another return on that investment year after year. And so you see these fantastical numbers that people think are just arbitrary numbers to get a 40 to 1 return on investment in agriculture systems. We have researchers in economics at the University of Minnesota who looked at this intensively, try to understand what those returns are. But when we develop take the Honeycrisp apple developed at the University of Minnesota, since we're having Horticulture Day. Honeycrisp apple has generated hundreds of millions of dollars every year coming back to the licensing of that apple into the state of Minnesota and across the globe. And so that happens every year, that return of developing that apple. Same thing with soybeans, same thing with other crops. We've developed wheat varieties. We just released a new Ramsey wheat variety this year. Those recur over and over again, so very high returns on investment. Minnesota is particularly high. We're a place where you should do agriculture. Simply put, we have fertile soils. We're blessed with natural rainfall. We have a tremendous place to do this, and to do that most effectively is our goal. So just a really quick, I usually bring a couple more of these with, but we're asked to keep this somewhat brief today. But these are 4 representational faculty. I try to broaden the spectrum out a bit here so you can have a sense of what's happening. Professor Heidi Roop is working in climatology. She's a climate scientist. She's worked everywhere from the Arctic, collecting core samples and ice, to here in Minnesota. She's now leading the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Project, which is a joint venture between both private sector and the state of Minnesota, to look at how do we adapt our built systems, our natural systems, our cropping systems. How do we prepare that for the climate change that's occurring as we're observing in Minnesota? And so that's actually turned into now a fund from the USGS, the U.S. Geological Science Service. We're now the Midwestern Climate Adaptation Hub for the upper Midwest in the U.S. And she's leading that effort along with a broad cohort of people who are working that as well. So just a fantastic program, has huge benefits. She came in through a GREET program. Annie Claude, she works with, actually I have slides of each of these as I go through this, so I'll use those. Annie Claude, she's an extension educator example. She's working quite a lot with urban vegetable and fruit production systems. She works in food safety as well as planting and harvesting and management of those crops. One of the big elements, as you often hear in vegetable production, is, of course, if you're providing natural fertilizers on that, manure, you have food safety issues that emerge from the microbes that come along with that. How do we help train people in proper management of vegetables from farm to table or if they're selling at farmers markets or wherever? She's actively engaged in those programs as part of AGREET. Jake Jungers is working, he's in agronomy and plant genetics. When I was talking about Forever Green, the perennial crops programs, Jake's a part of that. He's a CFANS person who's working at teaching. One of the things he does, he not only works with our undergraduate and graduate students at the University of Minnesota, he's working with schools in bringing STEM education into schools. And one of the things we find is students in high school, elementary school are really connected to food and agriculture. It's a great way to bring science and mathematics and engineering into a classroom in a way that students can relate to it, something they do every day. You know, we're all consumers of food. So he takes what he's learning and researching around cover crops into that environment and training that next generation. And Will Noyes is, again, a research and extension appointment. She's working in the animal ag sector, a lot of work on antimicrobials and biological versions, moving to more natural systems and how do we control animal health, and she's employed in veterinary medicine. So with that, that's a broad spectrum of it. I thought I'd bring Professor Miller here to talk a little bit about his work here and ask him to present. He's actually, I'll put it, he'll probably raise it too, but this is my shameless commerce division of the University of Minnesota. We operate, CFANS operates the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, if you've been down to visit that in the past. And Brandon's work is there in nursery crops. And the economist in me says I have to say the nursery crop industry, Paul, you may correct me, is roughly of $500 million in terms of the plant sales that come from nursery business in Minnesota. That's not including the landscape and ancillary services that go with it. That's the plants that are developed. So with that, it's a significant part of our industry, and we're looking at those as well as part of this program. So with that, Brandon?
Yes. Thank you, Professor.
Madam
Thank
Chair.
you, Dean Berg. Professor Miller, you may proceed. Please
Thank you.
identify yourself before the committee.
Thank you, Chair Vang and the committee. My name is Brandon Miller. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Horticultural Science at the University of Minnesota. I'm housed at the St. Paul campus, but I wear a number of different hats. I'm also curator of plant collections, or one of the curators at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. And as part of this Agri program, I'm a state extension specialist. And my appointment, I work with cold climate perennial specialty horticultural crops. And you know, what does that mean for, it's a mouthful. I work with woody plants and herbaceous perennials. I work in the ornamental realm of horticulture. And my objective here today is just to give you kind of a brief overview of what my program looks like, what I work on, and how Agri funds are supporting the green industry in the state of Minnesota. Now, when I say the green industry in Minnesota, I am talking about the horticultural components, the nursery producers, the landscape practitioners, arborists, and that kind of category. And I just wanted to briefly start out with a bit of a rationale for why this work is important and why it's timely. And if you can see the slides here, more frequent and severe weather events are one of the big challenges that we encounter in the state of Minnesota, regionally, nationally, and beyond. And this seems to be a new, kind of a normal component of our climate that we'll need to work around in the green industry. So whether that's spring flooding and severe drought in the summer, of which is a pattern we've experienced in the past 2 years, sudden windstorms that throw perfectly healthy trees, or hail events that are damaging plants at critical points in development. These are all factors that we need to work around in the landscape realm. And what I don't have on the slide here is an example of a pest like the emerald ash borer, an exotic pest that might be causing millions of dollars in damage. And all of these combined, what they have in common is that they really kind of take advantage of our landscapes when we rely too heavily on a small scope of plants. So my whole, shtick with horticulture is increasing landscape resiliency by embracing landscape diversity. So my role, you can think of me kind of as a liaison between the university and the green industry, is to facilitate crop development and use. So look for underutilized novel plant material that we can use to bolster that resiliency in the managed landscape. And what you have an example of here is shagbark hickory. It's one of our native trees. That's a wonderful plant. It's very ornamental, but it's also quite resilient in the face of drought and even some degree of flooding. And so this is a plant that we don't have readily available in the nursery trade. What you have is kind of a flow model, if you will, of identifying plant material that has horticultural merit, working with producers to kind of solve those production issues, ultimately with the objective of having this new option in the plant palette, or the tool belt, if you will, to employ in our managed landscapes, especially in the built and urban environment. So my program, I'm a research and extension split, 60% extension, 40% research. And what you have here is kind of a flow chart of how I envision my program working. I took the job in August of 2021, so I have I've been at the university a short amount of time. I'm in my second year. But What you have here is the Center for Winter Hardy Landscape Plants. It's the umbrella category that I have my research and extension programs under. And you can see if you kind of follow through the arrows, it's basically an ebbing and flowing of how the research and extension work together, ultimately to support stakeholders throughout the state. So the three main tiers of my research program are looking at facilitating or developing new practices for landscape management to increase resiliency and sustainability. Nursery production, I've kind of talked about that. Finding workarounds for plant material that can help improve the resiliency of our managed spaces, but they might have a challenge in the production pipeline. So working with those producers to enable new opportunities. And last but certainly not least is characterizing plant stress tolerance. So we have floods, we have droughts, we have cold climate. We need to be able to characterize what kind of plant material will perform where and share that information in an appropriate way with stakeholders so that everybody in Minnesota can access that information and inform their landscapes, whether that's a homeowner or that's a green industry professional. That said, the stakeholders, the main groups I work with are those green industry professionals, Minnesotans in general, but also external audiences. This program is expected to have recognition on the national and international scale. And so this work really is timely and important for the northern climates around the world. Lastly, here I have a handful of images just to show the outreach and the deliverables, or just some of the examples. Working with the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum on the far left side, you have an unusual birch species that's been in the collection for 60 years, and it's just one example of many of this fantastic resource as an outdoor laboratory and an outdoor classroom. So being able to conduct research to introduce new crops for our producers in the green industry, and ultimately new options for stakeholders to purchase and utilize. On the top right, you have a pruned hydrangea, and this is an example of that outreach, that extension, or bringing the university to our stakeholders. This was collaborative work with our other extension educators, where we brought folks into the Arboretum and taught them how to prune this specific crop. It's a very popular plant for Minnesota. And so really just trying to have that engagement with the public. In the middle there, you have a unusual nutritional deficiency with a nursery crop. It's called mouse ear disorder. And it's ultimately, it's an example of something that we know very little about, both scientifically and from an applied nursery perspective. But I have a graduate student who's training to characterize the symptoms, be able to identify what species are susceptible, ultimately to determine new protocols so that we can provide that for those producers and help enable new crop development. And then on the bottom right, before I wrap up here, just an example of kind of tying this all together. This is on the St. Paul campus, just right next to those soybean fields on the St. Paul campus. We have undergraduate summer interns in the Learning Garden for Horticultural Science. We have master gardeners from Ramsey, Anoka, and Hennepin County, and my team all working together to build this public garden called Goldie's Garden. And ultimately what we used it for was Gopher Adventures summer program, where we brought youth ages 6 through 12 through the university summer camp program to learn about horticulture. So we brought all of these communities together, and it was a great opportunity for education. And it's just one example of many of the ways that we use the resources here in Minnesota at the St. Paul campus and at the Landscape Arboretum to further the mission of the university, and also with the Agri program. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for the time to be able to introduce you briefly to my program, and we'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you.
Sure,
Thank
thank
you,
you.
Dean Byrne and Professor Miller, for your testimony. And as always, thank you for all the work that you do to support the agriculture industry here. I will open up the floor for questions, and I can start off with the first question that I have. Dean Byrne, could you give more details about like where the funding comes from for AGREET, and then how do you guys make those decisions in dedicating those funding to certain research?
Chair Vang, thank you. The funding comes through the Ag Committee, and it goes through the Department of Agriculture, Minnesota Department of Agriculture. So the Minnesota Department of Agriculture is the administrative branch of the funding, and then they disperse the funding to us based on a grant that we write to them each year as part of that funding. So it's appropriated by the state through the Department of Agriculture. the second part of your question about how we identify what these areas are. So we actually it's a fairly complex priorities process. So we as the university, we put together what we think are areas of need we have relative to, as Dr. Miller was just talking about, we have people working these fields all the time. What's the area of need in the state? What are we working on? We need space to fit that need. So we present essentially the University of Minnesota's priorities for what we would like to have for researchers that fit this. The advisory committee I spoke about is a group that basically brings and this is the farmers and the producers, that's the key part of our decision. They bring in theirs. So we kind of do it in our own, this is my matchmaking version. We have what are the priorities we each have? And then we look at, and they're oftentimes, actually, most of the time, that's why it's worked well, is we're pretty synced up on that to start with, but look for new opportunities. We get feedback from some of their constituents as well and more broadly. And then we come together, when we were first starting this, twice a year, we would come together and create lists of where we thought those priorities were and start to work through those lists. We reevaluate that every time we meet, and we meet every year. During COVID, we had a bit reduced schedule. We met once 2021, and then we just met a month or so ago. And so we come back to those. But we're really looking at soliciting what are those needs across the industry, what are the needs across, and as Dr. Miller was talking about, meeting with people who are actually doing the work in horticulture in that case, and so on. So that's the process.
Thank you. And how many of, I guess those, are those research, is it like often one-time research grants, or are they like phases or long-term? Like, I guess, give me an idea of how frequent those are.
Yeah, good question, Chair Vang. So the funding that comes in, when we fund a faculty member, for example, just to give some context, those are permanent faculty, so that most of the funding from GREET goes to that's the human infrastructure part. The grants they receive are typically, they're termed grants, so those will range from multi-years. We often have, when I was talking about agriculture and the long-term nature of the work we do, they're typically 3 to 5 years and cycle through. And so they may be short-term grants, depending on what they are. So it really depends. We rarely get recurring, ongoing, in any capacity grants that come through that avenue. But what happens is we, on average, this last year, we had roughly, I'll get this number wrong, but about annually $40 to $50 million in grants coming into CFANS for research grants by faculty. So our average, we stay in a fairly stable range around the level of grants we get overall. And they are revolving through.
All right, thank you. Representative Frederick?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Regarding the rapid response funds, I'm curious in what would be a trigger for some of those funds, and then how do those triggers get set?
Dean Burke?
Thank you. So we have a committee, advisory committee that works with the Rapid Ag Response Funds, and that's again it's a similar cross section of agriculture in Minnesota. They actually bring to us, like I said, many times. For example, I'll use another example. We work in chronic wasting disease has been one we have. Just like the rest of the state, we're engaging quite a bit with them. For example, Minnesota Department of Agriculture, we engage a lot with the Department of Natural Resources. We have two invasive species research center, one aquatic, one terrestrial, that's also supported somewhat by the state. And so we have a pretty good pulse on it as part of that. And through extension, we're out in the communities. We have a pretty good sense. We're also monitoring with agencies what's happening there. And then we come together to identify with that advisory group which of the areas, there's only so much funding, which of those areas are priorities this year. So they change time to time. We usually have no more than 2 cycles for any rapid response grant. What we expect to happen is the faculty member to go out and identify longer term sources if it's a long-term problem. And so it's been great not only for addressing the immediate impact for rapid response, but it also primes that pump, because oftentimes you go for a USDA grant, for example, or an NIH or NSF grant, National Science Foundation grant. Those take a year or 2 years to get in place. So Rapid Ag Response provides a bridge for that person to identify what the problem is, go and seek additional funding, and so it moves off Rapid Ag Response funding onto a permanent funding to go longer term. So it's a great way to both bring attention to start with and then leverage that out to move it forward. So it is a way to get that funding quick, get something started, get the people on board, and then move ahead with addressing the problem.
Representative Frederick? Representative Jacob?
Thank you, Chair Fang. So you touched briefly on cover crops. So is your involvement just restricted strictly to research, or are you providing any program funds to producers for covers?
Dean Berg?
Chair Manning, thank you. Representative, we look broadly, we're actually now the phase of that where we're looking at market development for it. As we have new crops, now I'll fill in your answer a bit from the back there. So we are looking beyond just the development of the crops to actually putting those into market uses. And one of our strategies, we started roughly 7 years, when I became dean, we started looking at a strategy of how do we work across, if you develop a new crop, and I'll use wheat, everybody's familiar with it. Wheat didn't just show up one day and we could mill it and grind it and turn it into bread, right? You have characteristics we bred for quality traits in wheat to improve wheat 10,000 years ago. We're doing that same work with these new perennial crops, and there's also annual crops in that as well that we're working on. So pennycress is an example that's got real oil and fuel utilization characteristics we think are really exciting. And those crops don't just, as we grow them, they have to be refined to be usable. So kerns I was talking about is the perennial grain. We had to develop kerns so it could be used in baking. And so our food science department works with our agronomists. And as the agronomists identify new varieties, our food science department is taking those varieties. You have to, of course, separate the chaff from the germ, start to mill that down, what its baking, cooking characteristics. And then they can bring that information, and now with molecular genetics and other elements, you can bring that information back into your breeding programs and improve the variety. And we've grown the yield rates of intermediate grass about 75% over 5 years, which is astronomically fast compared to historically. So we do look at not only what is that new crop, how do we use that crop, and now we're developing if we're going to bring that into a production system, the largest crop in Minnesota is corn. And so we've got a huge infrastructure to move corn from the farmer's field off into the manufacturing production side of it and into the grocery store, for example, and cereals. That infrastructure is not there for Kernza. Some of it is, but combines are different. The manufacturing processing is different. So we're now looking at how do we help develop those with the private sector. And General Mills has been active in Kernza, for example, to bring those into actual use. So it's a complex, it's both development at the crop level, and it's moving that actually into the food chain so people can consume it, or the manufacturing chain.
Representative Jacob?
Yeah, so strictly research. But
Well,
the question specifically was are you providing any program funds for producers to put crops on the ground, or is your work just strictly limited to research?
Yeah, we're focused on research. The extension part is helping farmers put it on the ground, but we don't support their acquisition of the crop seed, for example, or to do that work.
Thank you.
Representative Anderson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple of questions. First, for Dr. Miller, as our ash trees slowly disappear, will you see our streets being lined with wild shagbark hickory, or what do you see as replacing the ash trees if we lose them?
Professor Miller?
Yes, thank you. Chair Vang and Representative Anderson. That's a really good question. So as we lose our ash trees, and we are losing them now to the emerald ash borer, I would say that shagbark hickory is one of many plants that we could utilize to take their place. But really the objective or the goal would be not to just replace them with one single species, but to use a spectrum of different plants, ideally plants that we've done some research on that we can indicate are particularly well suited to these severe weather patterns that we're expecting going forward. So the key would be diversity. Absolutely, it could be shagbark hickory, but ideally we'll have a variety of different species that we'll utilize.
Representative Anderson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would agree that I'm hearing we're planting a lot of maple trees, and we could be heading for the same type of situation down the road. So the diversity is key. Dean Burr, question on a serious note. You know, the bird flu is still around, and agreed funding is going to the university. Is progress being made? What things are you looking at in terms of possible vaccines, or how can we stop this thing?
Dean Burr?
Chair Vang, Representative Anderson, that's a great question. I mean, it's similar to any epidemic, and now it's becoming, we think, endemic perhaps with avian influenza. We are working on, and the vet med school is more capable of answering this than I am, but certainly work on new vaccines for that. A lot of it is biosecurity so that we can control and maintain that piece, which means trying to prevent, if it is endemic, how do you reduce its impact across farms? and managing those elements. Certainly diagnostics, which is really difficult because of migratory fowl. We have a place where it's going to enter the state. There's no, borderline that stops that. So it's going to be like most of these things, it's a multi-pronged challenge that we're trying to address. But ideally, as we've done in swine industry, beef industry over time, the work that's going on with vaccines, there are some emerging vaccines that can be used to do that. The wildlife management piece is a key piece, the reservoirs that are out there. So to say when that was going to end, I think now we're getting into that stage where can we prevent, control, and manage it, and then perhaps move to that stage where we do find an ideal vaccine.
Representative Anderson?
Well, Madam Chair, thank you. Yeah, hopefully that, the biosecurity, I think our producers are doing a really good job at that, but if it's the wild migrating birds that are keeping this thing alive and keeping it going, it's worrisome, and I just hope that we can make some progress, either additional funding for research or something to get some answers and get going on this. So, thank you.
Representative Hansen?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Dean Burr. I want to thank you for the initial CWD funding at the U and establishment of MinPro. I mean, those initial dollars that came here were important in getting started, and now you have a nation-leading research institute that frankly, all over the world is looking at. So thank you for that. I think that's a good example of how research can be a catalyst. I have a broader question, though. I've sat on this committee for a long time, and you and I have been in these circles for a long time, and what happens here is we have people protect their own cheese, right? That agriculture is agriculture, and when we have advisory groups or when we have input, when we get public input, the tradition has been is that, well, nobody else understands us, so we need to take care of ourselves. And what I'm asking is, should this be the time when we have other people understand us? Should we open up and have people who aren't directly involved in agriculture? So there's not the question of academic capture or regulatory capture involved in decision-making. So when you have an advisory committee, you go outside of the usual list, and you go outside of the folks who are always at the table and bring new people to the table so that the message can be spread and the involvement, because they're involved in the decision-making. And I know that's hard, and I know that there's probably resistance from those that are at the table because they have that access. But as agriculture becomes a smaller and smaller portion, and as we age, it would be better, I think, if we open this up and have more people involved rather than just being locked in to the model from 30 or 40 years ago.
Dean Burr?
Chair Vang, Representative Hansen, thanks for your comments. Just a context in that, that's a possibility within the legislation. There is the designated, it's within there what the groups are. I'll just comment, I agree with you that we do look across in our broad programs across those spectrums. The GREET is defined, but our need to get response from diverse communities is only growing. And so we do that on an ongoing basis in most of our areas. I can't think of an area where we don't have within that aspect. In this particular case, that's something that I think comes up through the conversations regarding a GREET here. And thank you for your support as well through those programs too. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Right.
Any further questions? All right. Well, that is all that we have for today's agenda. Thank you so much, Dean Byrne and Professor Miller, for your testimony today. It is always good to hear from a GREET.
Thank you, Chair Vang.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, members.
And so that is all that we have for today's agenda. Our next meeting is Tuesday, January 17th, 2023. And this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.